Hi, my name's Megan. I met my friend Diana through another nonprofit that helps survivors of domestic violence. And I am very passionate about this topic because it's something that I have been through as well. And it's something that most people don't really like to talk about or don't understand if they haven't been through it. So, finding a community of other survivors and other women who've experienced similar trauma and experiences is just so powerful, I think. Because one of the things that most people don't realize is that abusers tend to pick really strong women. I think there's like a social narrative that abusive men pick on weak women and
Mm.
find someone that's easy to control. So that's kind of one of the kind of topics of domestic violence that a lot of people in society just don't understand because it seems kind of backwards that abusers would target women that are very successful, smart, high achieving, and all of those things. But part of that is because someone who's abusive likes power and control and they like to look really good. So they want their partner to make them look good.
Definitely.
So,
How do you, in your personal experience, like how do you overcome the abuser? Like how do you find the first identifications of abusive, and then how do you prolong?
yeah, that's a great question. I was so young. I met my ex-husband when I was 19, and he was really like my first serious boyfriend. Because I was a very serious high school athlete. I played college soccer, and I got straight A's. I was super serious with school. Never really dated in high school because I didn't have time because I was so busy with getting good grades and playing varsity sports. So I met him my sophomore year in college, and I remember him telling me that he didn't like my friends. I think that was probably the first sign, that isolation. And I had a really strong group of girlfriends, and we'd go out and have fun. And he just didn't like that. He wanted to have me with him at all times. So I think that was the first thing I noticed. Of course, looking back, like at the time, I was excited to have a boyfriend, and I sort of blamed my girlfriends for, saying that bad things about him because I think they saw some of the red flags before I did. So it's very subtle, like the frog in the boiling water analogy, right? And that's one of the things. Another thing that so many people just don't get, that it can happen to anyone, right? Like it's not the stereotypical, someone who's not educated or someone who lives in poverty. That's kind of what people assume a survivor is. And that was not me. And I know that's not Diana. And a lot of the women I've talked to, it's just really hard to talk about it when you come from a middle class family, when your parents are educated, when you're educated. It's just so many people don't understand, like, why would you put up with that? Why wouldn't you leave them, is like the main question people ask. And and the cycle of domestic violence is totally addicting on the brain. That's another piece of research that I'm really interested in. I focused all of my graduate studies on domestic violence research. So that part really fascinated me because I lived it and I felt it, right? It feels as addicting on the brain as.
I think I think it's the dopamine, right? It is the fact that like you want the same like kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is really interesting that you brought that up. I think that, for example, right, we live in today's standards now. We live something called toxic um, uh, relationships, and people love them sometimes. I find out to see that if you scroll out on Twitter, 23-year-olds like myself, they say, oh, we miss the toxicity on women, or like we miss that toxic relationship because it was fun. And that's where I understand it. At the end of the day, it's really traumatic, and I don't think it's healthy. And
Mhm.
people be and our the new norm now is like toxic relationship are fun, and it's not right.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Absolutely. I think our society totally normalizes that based on all the shows we watch, right? Like, what's that 50 Shades of Grey movie? That's totally normalizing a controlling, kind of financially controlling, everything controlling abusive behavior, but we're like sexualizing it and glorifying it to be this like, oh, some rich man is going to come and save you and pay for everything and buy you nice cars. And that's just not reality. So,
No, for real. I just want to circle back with your experiences, like how, like as yourself, like going through this bad time with your ex-husband, and you were 19. How do you, at what age you start to realize, all right, well, fuck, this is actually bad. I need to get away from this.
it was when my daughter was born. That was absolutely the first moment where I realized that I did not want her to grow up seeing how he treated me and seeing that that was normal, because I felt that it wasn't fair to her. She didn't deserve a father like that. She didn't deserve to see a man treat a woman like that. And so, really, my daughter gave me the strength to leave my ex husband and actually think about leaving.
Right. And I'm yeah. How many kids do you have, if you don't mind me asking?
Just the one. Yeah.
Perfect. No,
Yeah.
that's good, man. No, definitely. I
No.
what the hell are they loud as fuck? Hold on, let me close the door.
Someone vacuuming?
What the hell? I've never heard of that. That shit loud. Can you hear it? Is it really loud?
Not anymore. Now it's good. It was earlier.
Oh man, you should have told me. No, that's funny. Damn, that's crazy. Um, wow. Okay, so you find your daughter. You start to realize, all right, this is abusive. What happened next?
Then I went to therapy. I mean, the worst parts of the abuse happened after we got married, which is really common because once you're married, a lot of times abusers then are like, okay, now you're my object, you belong to me.
Mm,
That was exactly what happened. And then my daughter was born right after we'd done a legal wedding, and then we had a ceremony, like the big fancy ceremony, when she was 10 months old, and it was right after that that the physical stuff started to happen. So there were some police reports, and um, we had met in the military. So we were both in the Coast Guard when we met. And I was no longer in after my daughter was born, but he was. And we were court ordered to go to couples like marriage counseling, which, looking back now, now that I know all the research, you're not supposed to force a victim to go to therapy with an abuser. And he only went to one session. I went to all 12. And the therapist met him one time and was like, he's abusive and you need to make a safety plan and you need to get away or things are going to get a lot worse.
How can someone have how can someone tell that to a therapist, or how can like yourself be like, wow, you're right, I do have an abusive relationship? Because I think there's a lot, plenty of women and men that that they just don't want to leave. Like it's
Right.
hard for them to leave, and you have a daughter, and
Mhm.
I'm assuming the benefits of the marriage of being in the army was like beneficial. Like, so for you, Megan, how do you come to realize, oh shit, okay, I gotta move on, I gotta change my life? Like how does your brain work like that? That to me is super amazing and valuable.
No, you're totally, that it absolutely is. I think that that's like the $1 million question with abusive relationships, right? And especially the hardest is when they're emotionally abusive and it doesn't get physical yet, because you're just waiting. And I feel like I was at that point for about 4 years where I was like, okay, if he just hits me, then I'll leave. Right. And for the longest time, that didn't happen. I mean, he did absolutely everything aside from physically attack me until the very end. And so I was almost waiting for that physical attack to happen, because I knew, I remember just feeling this void. Like I was so unhappy I was depressed. I was anxious. I was vacuuming the house like 5 times a day. Um, because I was never good enough. He would always come home and say, "Oh, the house isn't clean enough. The food's not cooked well enough." I mean, it was like these standards, and it didn't matter what I did. It was just something was always wrong. Like whether I was working or staying home with my daughter, either thing, he would find a problem and just use it to kind of verbally abuse me constantly. So the therapist I saw, she told me that I had to start standing up to him, because I think what happens is they condition you to not stand up to them and to like put them on this pedestal, and not challenge or question them. And so when you do, that makes them angrier. And so I think that's where a lot of women get stuck, especially women I've talked to who were married for like 20 years or more, because it's not yet physical, right? So they're waiting for some sort of physical thing to happen for that to be enough to leave. So I took the therapist's advice and I started, telling him no, or like trying to like, you know, be stronger. I got a job, which he wasn't happy about. So I wasn't near him as often. I got space and I got my own money, which he hated that. Right. So we eventually, the last thing that happened was we got in a massive fight because I told him I didn't want to do something. And he broke through an entire door, like cracked down a door. He was so angry, and grabbed me by the hair and ripped out like a whole chunk of hair from the back of my head and like attacked me and threw me on the ground. And then that was it. And my daughter was in the other room crying because
Oh,
she heard that. So then that was like the moment where I was like, okay, if he's gonna do this to me in front of my daughter, that's it. you know
definitely. I want to circle back with the conversation of how how was the first time you stand up to them? I feel like you were probably nervous, shaking.
Mhm.
Like the first interaction was like, oh my God, she's standing up to me. How
It was,
was that like? How was the experience? And how did you keep going with that momentum of the snowball effect of just keep going and be like, you know what, I'm gonna stop to this.
I think I'd shut down for so long that I did have a lot of anger. And I think a lot of victims forget how to access their anger, because you get so shut down and it's not safe to feel angry, but anger is an emotion that's there to protect you when you're in danger. And so that was like one of the things the therapist helped me understand. And I did a lot of role plays with her in sessions of like, what are you going to say back to him? How are you going to like stand up for yourself? So doing that role play practice. Another thing that was super helpful is the therapist had me write everything down. Like part of the things abusers do is they gaslight and they lie to you, right? And they make you feel like you're the crazy one. So then you don't remember. Your brain is wired to like shut down during trauma, right? So because you don't want to feel bad. So that's like a protection mechanism. Um, so that's kind of breaking through that is really hard, and it's repetition. You have to almost like rewire your brain through writing everything down and then practicing like with a therapist what you're going to say, how you're going to react, and all of that.
What for you, did you always keep the same therapist or did you actually like you trial and error? A lot of people don't understand that, or something that I learned with my practices is that sometimes the one therapist is not the one and you gotta keep going and people and something that I learned with my therapy when I was doing my clinician work, it was like I do like a couple questions, I talk to them, and you don't feel the energy, and usually you move on to the next and to the next. How can people do that without being like, well, she and him and her another one?
Yeah, and that, you know what, that's one of the hardest things people don't realize is like they might have one bad experience with a therapist and then never want to go back.
Mm-hmm.
And I never thought I'd end up as a therapist. I mean, I always thought it was so stupid to talk about emotions because that's kind of how I was raised, right? Just shove it under the rug, put your head down, get the work done, don't complain about anything in life. And I remember my dad made me see a therapist in high school, and she told me that if I didn't learn how to stand up to myself for myself, I would end up with an abusive partner. And it's chilling to think back to that because that was the first therapist I had. And I only saw her for like 6 months. And that was, I was a teenager and I hated therapy at the time. And I was like, this is ridiculous. But then when the whole thing happened with my ex-husband, I only saw that therapist for 12 sessions. So once a week for what, like 3 months maybe. And I think I was extremely lucky. Like I was appointed, I didn't even get to choose. And she ended up being an expert in domestic violence. And then I moved to Colorado and I was able to um, come to Colorado with my daughter. And I ended up winning a Colorado Supreme Court case for domestic violence here based on our entire case of what happened. And um, I found another therapist here that I saw for over 2 years who was also an expert in domestic violence, and she was absolutely amazing. But it's not something we learn in school, which I think it should be, right? Like, how do you find a good therapist? Like, it's one of the biggest things I wish people knew is it's okay to like therapy shop, right? Like, try someone, and if they're not good, if it's not helping, find somebody else, and also like look for someone who's specialized in what you're dealing with, right? So,
Yeah, 100%. That is super crucial. As yourself, as a clinician now, what are some tips or things that you can tell men or women to, like, when it comes to like the first therapy session? Like, what are the first thing you should do? Questions, and how can people identify the right one, quote unquote?
I would say, it also is like it's a relationship in a lot of ways, and so feeling comfortable is number one. A therapist should definitely be a really good listener, ask questions, care about you, and you'll get that feeling usually in my experience right away. And there's times where even me as a therapist, there's certain clients I have where it's hard to make that connection, right? And it's not like a one size fits all. And then that's another thing is there's so many interventions or forms of therapy that can be used, and most people don't understand what all those differences are and which ones are specific to what they're dealing with. So it's really important to do a lot of research on that. Like, for example, for domestic violence, you want someone who specializes in family relations, in domestic violence, in trauma, EMDR, childhood trauma, all of that kind of stuff. So, I think that if someone is looking for the right therapist, the first session they should be asking those questions like, what are your qualifications? What's your treatment plan going to look like? Are you going to like check up on like what are we working on, kind of thing? And we don't teach people that, and therapists don't say that up front either.
Definitely. No, 100%. So, um, abusive happened. You got hit. You got chunk over here happen. What happened next? You went to divorce. You went to counseling. Then you got divorced. How was the divorce process? Was there any like trouble, or was it really smoothly with all this shenanigans?
That's a whole story. Yeah, so there were two instances. The first one, which was resulted in us being required to go to therapy, was right after the wedding. A week after our wedding ceremony, he started screaming at me and threatened to punch me in the face in front of our daughter while I was holding her, and ripped up my clothes in front of my face. All things which I didn't even at the time realize were forms of abuse. So I went and stayed with my dad for a week, because I didn't know what to do. I was frozen. And I think that's another piece of domestic violence is like the fight, flight, or freeze, right? So a lot of people don't understand, their own responses when they're dealing with this kind of thing. And I'm a freezer. Like I stop thinking, I don't know what to do. So I went over to my dad's house and he started stalking the house. He was driving by like every hour, and then he called the police on me, um, and said that he didn't know why I wasn't answering the phone. And I told them what happened, and they made a domestic violence report, which at that time, I didn't even realize it was domestic violence. And then we were ordered to go to therapy. Then I was with this therapist, and then the second thing happened, which was like the ultimate, like he broke through a door to get to me because he was so angry that I was setting a boundary or a limit with him and saying, no, like I need space right now. I don't want to talk to you. And he couldn't stand that.
100%. I think man, I never experienced that. So it's hearing things like that always gets me like always trouble. Like why do they think like that? I never understood it to this day. I wish I should have pursued my master's to be like you, but hey, listen, I can't do
You'll be
it.
fine.
But to just to end the conversation, like what are some things, what are some tips, advice, anything that you can just tell the people that you can just prevent them just to at least be at this tiny safe? Because from my opinion, always uh, knowing for experience, passive experiences, I learned a lot from people. and
Yep.
and 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 for yourself, Megan, how what are some tips and tricks you can just tell women and men to like just be aware of things, to just check up on things, to write things, get a journal,
Yeah.
whatever.
Write everything down. That's number one. That was the best advice I got from any therapist was if there's any red flag, write it down. I follow Dr. Derusula, shoot, I'm forgetting her last name, but she does really good YouTube videos and podcasts about domestic violence and what to look for. So she says a lot of really helpful things. And one of the things she says is if someone is really late on a first date, that's kind of a red flag because that means they don't have empathy. Another thing I always look for is if you're like, especially in the early stages of dating and someone is talking really poorly about all of their exes and it sounds like, they didn't have any healthy breakups, that's like a huge red flag, right? Because most people that aren't abusive, they'll have good relationships that just ended, or like it'll be a variety, whereas someone who's abusive is always going to talk about all of their exes very badly. And so that's kind of a red flag. And then also if you say no, so that's a big thing, is just saying no one time and then how they respond. So if someone cannot like understand or listen to your no, that's a huge red flag. So for example, if you're like, no, I don't really want to like go to this restaurant, let's do a different one, and they're like, no, please, I really want you to go, right? So that's like a form of a lack of empathy. So just paying attention, right, to their responses and how if it feels also like love bombing, that's a huge red flag. And that's something that we don't talk about a lot about, is if it's too good to be true early on in the relationship, that's the love bombing. So where they're telling you everything you want to hear, they're saying I love you way too quickly, talking about wanting to have babies or move in. Like my ex-husband proposed after we were together for a month. That's like a huge red flag. Yeah. And he was like talking about marrying me after maybe 2 weeks of dating and like introduced me to his parents. I mean, looking back, I'm like, what was I thinking? Right. But when you're in it, you're like, oh my gosh, this person loves me. And it's not love at all. It's an obsession. Right. And it's not healthy. So a healthy relationship's kind of gonna feel boring, and that's okay. So that's another thing. Like if you're looking for a healthy relationship, boring is kind of good, right? You don't want to like have this like, yeah. And that's like most people's reaction, right? Like, oh, I don't want it to be boring. And I don't mean boring in a sense of like, you don't like spending time together. I mean boring in a sense of they're not dramatic and they're not trying to like pick fights with you or be like, oh, we're going to go to Paris, like love bomb you. Like we're going to do all these amazing things, but then also criticize what you're wearing or, talk down to you, right? That's what I mean by the opposite of boring. My name is Megan Perocha. I am a licensed school counselor in Colorado. I also have a private practice. I do a lot of girls groups, teen girls groups, and we actually talk a lot about healthy relationships in those groups, which is, I think, something our society needs more of. I have done an ultra marathon and a couple of marathons. So I was growing up, I was an athlete and I'm still an athlete. And I've done a lot of things related to domestic violence. I won a state Supreme Court case, which changed state law to protect survivors of domestic violence. So they can now come to Colorado and seek support and safety and get a restraining order based on like virtual harassment via text, calls, stuff like that. And that was not possible until my case happened. And then I've spoken at the Women's March in Denver, as well as I've done a lot of policy work. I've worked on the Violence Free Colorado policy team, where I assisted with writing and doing research for state legislation to prevent domestic violence. So I'm very passionate about this topic because it's personal to me, and I don't want other women and children going through what I had to go through. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to my story. You can also contact me via email at parmeg27@gmail.com. That's my business email for my practice. So if you have any questions or need any advice regarding domestic violence, that's something I'm always open and willing to help with.